Have you ever been threatened with losing everything over a single wrong glance? I was standing on the edge of losing a career I'd built over 3 years, all because I didn't stand up fast enough when the CEO's wife walked past the charity gala table. But she didn't know one thing. The secret I'd been keeping for 8 months was exactly what would destroy her ambitions. Right in front of the people she feared most. And you'll want to hear this whole story, because this reversal hurt more than the wrongful termination ever could. My name is Samantha Taylor, but everyone calls me Sam. At 32, I'd clawed my way up to Global Market Development Director at Hendricks & Wallace Corp., a prestigious international business consulting firm headquartered in Boston's financial district. The gleaming 40-story tower on State Street had become my second home. And honestly, some weeks it felt more familiar than my actual apartment in Back Bay. I wasn't born into privilege like most of my colleagues. My parents ran a small accounting firm in Worcester, and every dollar of my education came from scholarships, part-time jobs, and student loans that still haunted my credit report. But I had something money couldn't buy: an ear for languages and a hunger that kept me working when others went home. During my junior year abroad in Shanghai, I'd fallen in love with Mandarin Chinese, not the romantic, movie version of falling in love, the obsessive, dictionary under my pillow, practicing tones in the shower kind of love. By the time I graduated, I was functionally fluent. And by the time Hendricks & Wallace hired me, I could negotiate contracts in Mandarin better than most native speakers. That linguistic skill had become my golden ticket. I'd built our Asian market division from absolutely nothing. No existing relationships, no inherited client base, just me, my language skills, and an unhealthy amount of caffeine. In 3 years, I'd grown our Asian revenue from 0 to 12 million annually. The numbers spoke for themselves, even if some of the old money partners still looked at me like I'd wandered into the wrong building. But success in corporate America isn't just about what you accomplish. It's about who notices, who takes credit, and who decides you're a threat. The morning everything changed started like any other. I arrived at the office at 6:30 a.m., beating most of the traffic and definitely beating most of my colleagues. The security guard, Miguel, waved me through with his usual, "Morning, Ms. Taylor," and I settled into my corner office with its view of Boston Harbor and the islands beyond. I was deep in reviewing contracts for a potential expansion into Vietnam when my assistant, Jenny, burst through my door without knocking. Her face was pale, and she was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "Sam, you need to prepare yourself," she whispered, glancing back at the door. "Mrs. Beaumont is here, and she's asking for you specifically. Security called up. She's on her way to your office right now." Claudia Beaumont, the CEO's wife. In 3 years at the company, I'd maybe exchanged pleasantries with her twice at company events. She was the kind of woman who wore her husband's success like designer jewelry. Beautiful, expensive, and meant to be noticed. Tall, blonde, with the kind of bone structure that suggested generations of good breeding and better nutrition. She moved through corporate events like she owned them, which, in a way, she did. "Did she say what she wanted?" I asked. But before Jenny could answer, I heard the distinctive click of expensive heels on marble flooring approaching my office. Claudia appeared in my doorway like an avenging angel dressed in Chanel. Her usually perfect composure was cracked, and her blue eyes held something I'd never seen before: pure, undiluted fury. "Ms. Taylor," she said, her voice carrying the kind of chill that could freeze champagne. "We need to talk. Privately." Jenny practically evaporated from the room, closing the door behind her with a soft click that somehow sounded ominous. Claudia didn't wait for an invitation. She strode to the chair across from my desk and sat down with the bearing of someone accustomed to owning every room she entered. But there was something different about her today. Beneath the perfectly applied makeup and the designer suit, she looked rattled. "I'm going to be direct," she began, her manicured fingers gripping her purse handle like a weapon. "Your behavior at the Children's Cancer Hospital gala last night was absolutely unacceptable." I blinked, genuinely confused. The gala had been a beautiful event. One of those Boston charity gatherings where old money met new money over 7-course dinners and silent auctions. Hendricks and Wallace had been a major sponsor, and I'd attended as part of the senior leadership team. I'm sorry, Mrs. Beaumont, but I'm not sure what you're referring to, I said carefully. Her laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Oh, please, don't insult my intelligence. When I walked past your table during the cocktail reception, you deliberately remained seated. You looked right at me and chose not to stand. In front of the Weatherbys, the Cabots, and half of Boston's social elite. The memory came back to me slowly. I'd been seated at one of the tables near the stage, reviewing my notes for the brief presentation I was scheduled to give about our international expansion. Claudia had indeed walked past, but I'd been so focused on my notes that I'd barely registered her presence. In retrospect, maybe I should have stood. But honestly, it hadn't even occurred to me. We weren't in a formal receiving line, and she was simply walking from one group of people to another. Mrs. Beaumont. I apologize if my behavior seemed rude. I was reviewing my presentation notes and didn't realize. Her voice rose slightly, and I caught a glimpse of something almost desperate in her expression. You've worked here for 3 years. You know perfectly well the protocols for company events. You chose to disrespect me, and by extension, my husband and this entire company. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't about etiquette or social protocols. This was about something else entirely. Something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I can assure you that wasn't my intention, I said, keeping my voice level. If I gave offense, I'm truly sorry. Sorry isn't going to fix this, Claudia snapped. I've already spoken to Jonathan this morning. Your employment with this company is terminated, effective immediately. Security will escort you out within the hour. The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 years of 18-hour days, missed weekends, sacrificed relationships, all of it about to disappear because I hadn't stood up quickly enough at a charity dinner. Mrs. Beaumont, surely this is an overreaction. The decision has been made, she said, standing abruptly. Your access cards will be deactivated, and you'll receive information about your final paycheck and benefits through HR. I suggest you use this as a learning experience about appropriate workplace behavior. She turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at me with something that might have been satisfaction. Oh, and Ms. Taylor? I'd recommend being very careful about how you discuss this termination with potential employers. Corporate Boston is smaller than you might think. And then she was gone, leaving me sitting in my office, staring out at the harbor and wondering how my life had just imploded over a moment I barely remembered. But as I sat there, something nagged at me. There had been something in Claudia's eyes, not just anger, but something that looked almost like recognition and fear. That's when it hit me. The reason her voice had sounded familiar. The reason she'd seemed so rattled. The reason this whole confrontation felt like theater. Like she was playing a role she'd rehearsed. Because 8 months ago, I'd met Claudia Beaumont before. She just didn't know that I knew. 8 months earlier, I'd been drowning in student loan payments and desperately looking for ways to supplement my income. The cost of living in Boston was brutal, and even with my corporate salary, I was barely staying afloat. That's when I discovered Ivy Tutors Private, an exclusive platform that connected high-end clients with specialized instructors for everything from foreign languages to test prep. My Mandarin skills were rare enough to command premium rates, and I'd been thrilled when I received a request for private tutoring sessions. The client was listed simply as Claire, and her requirements were specific: intensive Mandarin conversation practice, complete discretion, and sessions conducted at her Beacon Hill townhouse. The pay was extraordinary, $300 per hour, with a minimum commitment of 2 hours per session, twice weekly. It was enough to finally start making real progress on my loans. My first meeting with Claire had been unusual. The Beacon Hill address turned out to be a stunning 4-story townhouse on Mount Vernon Street, the kind of property that sold for 8 figures and came with its own historical society plaque. The woman who answered the door was elegant, imperious, and immediately set ground rules that should have sent up red flags. "You will address me as Ms. Claire," she'd said, not bothering with introductions. "You will not ask personal questions about my family, my husband, or my reasons for learning Mandarin. You will not discuss our sessions with anyone, ever. And you will sign this non-disclosure agreement before we begin." The NDA was more comprehensive than some I'd seen at Hendricks and Wallace. It covered everything from the content of our lessons to the location of our meetings, with financial penalties that would have bankrupted me several times over. But I needed the money. And Claire, as I came to know her, paid promptly and without question. The lessons themselves were bizarre. Claire had virtually no foundational knowledge of Mandarin, but she wasn't interested in starting with basics. Instead, she wanted me to drill her on very specific phrases and conversations, always related to business and investment opportunities. "How do I say I have extensive experience in international markets?" she'd ask. "How do I express my company has exclusive access to American distribution networks? What's the phrase for I can guarantee returns exceeding 20% annually?" I'd provide the translations, coach her on pronunciation, and watch her practice the same phrases over and over until she could deliver them with something approaching fluency. But it was clear she had no understanding of grammar, sentence structure, or how to deviate from the scripts we practiced. "Claire, it might be helpful if we work on some conversational basics," I'd suggested during our fourth session. "If someone asks you a question that's not in our practice scenarios, that won't be necessary." She'd cut me off. "I know exactly what conversations I'll be having. Just focus on what I've asked you to teach." The sessions continued twice weekly for months. Claire was demanding, never satisfied, and had a way of speaking to me that made it clear she considered me hired help rather than a professional educator. She never offered coffee or water, never asked about my day, and dismissed me the moment our 2 hours were complete. But she also began to reveal things about herself, perhaps without realizing it. References to Jonathan's business associates and complaints about investors who don't take me seriously, and mentions of proving I can handle international negotiations. Most tellingly, she'd sometimes practice her phrases while looking in the mirror, as if preparing for a performance. "I must project confidence," she'd mutter to herself in English between Mandarin drills. "They need to believe I'm sophisticated enough to handle this level of investment." By our 20th session, I'd pieced together that Claire was preparing for some kind of high-stakes business presentation involving Chinese investors. She was clearly wealthy: the townhouse, the designer clothes, the casual mentions of charity boards and country clubs. But she seemed desperate to prove something to someone. The sessions had continued right up until 3 weeks before the charity gala. Claire had suddenly canceled our remaining scheduled meetings, claiming she no longer needed my services. She'd paid me in full for the missed sessions and reminded me sternly about the confidentiality agreement. "You've never met me," she'd said as she handed me my final payment. "If anyone ever asks, you've never been to this address. And you've never taught Mandarin to anyone named Claire. Is that understood?" I'd nodded, taken my money, and thought I'd never see her again. Until last night, when Claudia Beaumont had walked past my table at the charity gala, and I'd recognized her voice from 8 months of intensive tutoring sessions. Sitting in my office after her ultimatum, I finally understood what had happened. Claudia had seen me at the gala and hadn't quite been able to place where she knew me from. But some part of her had recognized me, and rather than risk me connecting the dots, she'd decided to eliminate the problem entirely. She was going to fire me to protect her secret. The only problem was, I already knew her secret, and I had proof. Over the course of our tutoring sessions, I developed a habit that probably saved my career. I recorded everything, not out of any malicious intent, but because Claire's demands were so specific and her pronunciation so poor that I needed to track her progress between sessions. I'd started using my phone to record her practice phrases so I could review them later and identify areas where she needed the most work. Those recordings were still on my phone. 8 months of Claudia Beaumont pretending to be Claire, struggling through basic Mandarin phrases, and most damning of all, explicitly discussing her plans to use her language skills to impress Chinese investors in a deal that would finally prove to Jonathan and his partners that I'm more than just a pretty face. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the recordings. Hours and hours of audio, all carefully labeled and dated. Claudia's voice was unmistakable, and her comments about Jonathan left no doubt about her identity. In one particularly revealing recording from 6 months ago, she'd been practicing a phrase about exclusive investment opportunities when she'd broken character entirely. "This deal has to work, Maddie," she'd said, using the fake name I'd given her, Madison Reynolds. "Jonathan doesn't think I understand business, but this Chinese partnership could bring in $60 million in the first year alone. When I close this deal, he'll have to put me on the board of directors. His partners will have to take me seriously." She'd caught herself immediately and made me promise never to mention her personal comments. But I'd already been recording. Now, as I listened to that recording again, I realized Claudia had just made the biggest mistake of her privileged life. I spent the next 30 minutes carefully reviewing the recordings and taking notes. By the time I was done, I had a clear picture of what Claudia had been planning. She'd arranged some kind of business meeting or presentation involving Chinese investors, likely claiming fluency in Mandarin as one of her qualifications. She'd probably scheduled it for some time soon, confident that her months of phrase drilling would be enough to fake her way through. The irony was almost too perfect. She'd fired me to protect her secret, not realizing that her secret was exactly the leverage I needed to destroy her. I was just finishing my notes when my office door opened again. This time it was Jonathan Beaumont himself, CEO, majority shareholder, and one of the most powerful men in Boston's business community. Jonathan was in his late 40s, silver-haired, with the kind of understated confidence that came from generational wealth and Ivy League connections. He'd built Hendricks and Wallace from a mid-tier consulting firm into an international powerhouse, and he commanded respect from clients and competitors alike. He also looked deeply uncomfortable. "Sam," he said, closing the door behind him. "I'm sorry about this morning." Claudia was quite insistent about the situation. I studied his face. There was something there, embarrassment, maybe, or frustration. He clearly wasn't thrilled about firing one of his most productive directors over what amounted to a social slight. "I understand that Mrs. Beaumont was upset," I said carefully. "But Jonathan, surely you know that terminating me over something so minor could expose the company to a wrongful termination lawsuit." He winced. "Sam, I've been married to Claudia for 12 years. I've learned that sometimes it's easier to manage her concerns rather than fight them, especially when she feels her reputation has been damaged in public. So you're willing to destroy my career to manage your wife's feelings? I'm willing to offer you a very generous severance package and excellent references," he said. "Enough to keep you comfortable while you find another position. I know this isn't fair, but you value domestic peace more than professional integrity?" Jonathan's jaw tightened. "That's enough. Sam, the decision has been made. I'm trying to make this as painless as possible for everyone involved." I leaned back in my chair, studying him. This was the moment of truth. I could accept the severance, walk away, and spend the next 6 months job hunting while Claudia's actions haunted my professional reputation. Or I could play the only card I had. "Jonathan, what would you say if I told you that your wife has been lying to you about her qualifications for a major business deal?" His expression didn't change, but I caught a flicker of something in his eyes. "I'd say you're making a very serious accusation that could land you in legal trouble. What if I told you she's been secretly taking Mandarin lessons for 8 months, preparing to represent herself as fluent in Chinese for some kind of investor presentation?" Now his expression did change. The polite mask slipped, revealing something closer to alarm. "What if I told you I have recordings of those lessons, including her discussing plans to use fake language skills to secure a $60 million deal that would get her a seat on your board of directors?" Jonathan went very still. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "What exactly are you implying, Sam?" I pulled out my phone and scrolled to one of the more damaging recordings. I'm not implying anything. I'm telling you that your wife hired me 8 months ago to tutor her in Mandarin, using a fake name and having me sign an extensive NDA. She's been preparing for some kind of presentation involving Chinese investors, and based on our lessons, she has no actual language skills beyond memorizing specific phrases. I hit play on the recording. Claudia's voice filled the office, struggling through a pronunciation exercise and then breaking into her revealing commentary about proving herself to Jonathan and his partners. The color drained from Jonathan's face as he listened. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for nearly a minute. "How long have you known?" he finally asked. "I recognized her voice at the gala last night," I said. She recognized me too, although she couldn't quite place where from. That's why she's trying to get rid of me. She's afraid I'll expose her before she can pull off whatever she's planning. Jonathan ran his hands through his hair, suddenly looking every one of his 47 years. "The Shanghai presentation. It's next week. She convinced me to let her lead the negotiation with the Wen Group. 60 million in potential investment for our Asian expansion. She claimed she'd been studying Mandarin and could handle the cultural nuances better than our usual team." My stomach dropped. The Wen Group was one of the largest private investment firms in China. If Claudia fumbled a presentation with them, it wouldn't just embarrass her, it could destroy Hendricks and Wallace's reputation in the entire Asian market. "Jonathan, if she tries to conduct that meeting in Mandarin, it's going to be a disaster. She can barely manage the phrases I taught her. And she has no ability to handle unexpected questions or natural conversation." "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "The preliminary meeting is tomorrow. She's supposed to give them an overview of her qualifications and our expansion plans. If she fails, they'll assume your entire company is either incompetent or fraudulent." I finished. Neither option is good for business. Jonathan looked at me with something approaching desperation. "What do you want, Sam?" It was a fair question. 12 hours ago, I'd been focused on building market share and paying down student loans. Now I was sitting on information that could either save or destroy one of Boston's most successful consulting firms. "I want my job back," I said. "Full reinstatement, no negative marks on my record, and a written apology from your wife acknowledging that her accusations were unfounded." "Done." "I also want to be the one handling the Wen Group presentation. Claudia clearly isn't qualified. And if this deal falls through because of her deception, every employee at this company suffers." Jonathan hesitated. "Claudia will never agree to that." "Then don't tell her until it's too late for her to object." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. Finally, he nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Access to all the materials Claudia's been using to prepare. I need to understand exactly what she's promised them and how much damage control I'll need to do. I'll have everything sent to your office within the hour. And Jonathan, your wife fired me this morning over an imaginary slight at a charity gala. I'm willing to help save this deal and protect the company. But I want it very clear that I'm doing this for our employees and our clients, not for her." He nodded grimly. "Understood." After Jonathan left, I sat back in my chair and tried to process what had just happened. In the span of 3 hours, I'd gone from being fired to being handed the biggest presentation of my career. But I also knew that Claudia wasn't going to take this reversal lying down. She'd tried to destroy me over a perceived slight. When she realized I'd outmaneuvered her, she was going to come for me with everything she had. I spent the rest of the day reviewing materials for the Wen Group presentation and preparing for what I knew was going to be an ugly confrontation. Claudia had built her entire identity around being the perfect corporate wife, the woman who could move seamlessly between charity boards and business meetings. Learning that her husband had discovered her deception, and worse, that he'd chosen to trust me over her, was going to shatter that identity. The next morning, I arrived at the office early and wasn't surprised to find Claudia waiting outside my door. She looked like she'd slept poorly, and there was something wild in her eyes that I'd never seen before. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" she said without preamble. "I think I'm very good at my job," I replied, unlocking my office door. "Something you might have realized before you tried to fire me." She followed me into the office, closing the door behind her. You recorded our sessions. That's illegal. Actually, it's not. Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, which means I only needed my own permission to record our conversations. And since you hired me under false pretenses, using a fake name, and lying about your identity, I'm not even sure your NDA is legally enforceable. Her face went pale. You can't prove I hired you under false pretenses. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to another recording, this one from our very first session, where she'd explicitly told me to call her Miss Claire and never ask about her real identity. Can't I? Claudia stared at the phone, then back at me. What do you want? I want you to stay out of my way while I clean up the mess you've made, I said. The WEN Group presentation is tomorrow, and thanks to your lies, I have less than 24 hours to salvage a $60 million deal. That presentation was mine, she snapped. I arranged the meeting. I developed the proposal. You arranged a meeting you can't actually conduct, I interrupted. Did you really think you could fake fluency in Mandarin in front of native speakers? Did you think they wouldn't notice that you can only recite memorized phrases? I would have managed, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Claudia, I heard you practice for months. You can barely order food in Mandarin, let alone negotiate a complex investment deal. If you'd gone into that meeting, you would have humiliated yourself, your husband, and this entire company. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her processing the reality of what I was saying. Finally, she looked up at me with something that might have been desperation. I just wanted to prove I could do it, she said quietly. Jonathan's partners. They look right through me at board meetings. They smile and nod when I speak. But I can see in their eyes that they think I'm just decoration. I thought if I could close this deal. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. So you decided to destroy my career to protect your secret? Her face hardened again. You disrespected me in public. I couldn't let that stand. I was reading presentation notes and didn't notice you walking by. That's not disrespect. That's multitasking. You knew who I was. You should have. I should have what? Dropped everything and curtsied? Claudia, I don't work for you. I never worked for you, even when you were paying me to tutor you. You hired a service, and I provided it professionally and discreetly. The fact that you tried to have me fired over imagined slights says everything about your character and nothing about mine. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling between rage and something that might have been shame. The presentation is mine, she said finally. I won't let you take credit for my work. Then I guess you'll have to explain to the WEN Group why you misrepresented your qualifications, I said. I'm sure they'll be very understanding about being lied to by a potential business partner. The blood drained from her face as the implications hit her. If the WEN Group discovered her deception, it wouldn't just end her involvement in the deal, it could destroy Hendricks and Wallace's reputation with every potential Asian partner. You wouldn't, she whispered. I won't have to, I said. If you insist on conducting that presentation yourself, your lack of actual language skills will be obvious within the first 5 minutes. The only question is whether you want to fail quietly or spectacularly. Claudia stood there for another moment, clearly trying to find some angle, some way to maintain control of the situation. Finally, she seemed to deflate. I hate you, she said simply. I don't care, I replied. I care about doing my job and protecting this company's reputation. If you can't handle that, maybe you should reconsider your involvement in business operations. She left without another word, and I spent the rest of the day preparing for what I knew would be the most important presentation of my career. The WEN Group meeting was scheduled for 10 a.m. the following day in our main conference room, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston Harbor and enough technology to connect seamlessly with offices around the world. I arrived early to test all the equipment and review my materials one final time. The WEN Group delegation consisted of 3 people: David Wen, the company's managing director and son of the founder, Lisa Chen, their head of international investments, and Michael Zhang, their legal counsel. All 3 were impeccably dressed, supremely professional, and spoke perfect English, though I knew from my research that they preferred to conduct sensitive negotiations in Mandarin. Jonathan was there, of course, along with two other senior partners. And despite everything that had happened, Claudia was there too, dressed in a severe black suit and wearing an expression that could have frozen the harbor. Mr. Wen, Ms. Chen, Mr. Zhang. I began in Mandarin. Welcome to Boston. We're honored by your interest in partnering with Hendricks and Wallace. The surprise on their faces was immediate and positive. They'd clearly been expecting to conduct the meeting in English, and my fluent Mandarin greeting immediately established credibility. Ms. Taylor, David Wen replied in Mandarin. Your pronunciation is excellent. Where did you study? I was fortunate enough to spend time in Shanghai during my university years, I responded, also in Mandarin. The city taught me that successful business relationships are built on mutual respect and clear communication. I caught Claudia's expression out of the corner of my eye. She was sitting rigidly in her chair, her face pale, clearly understanding enough of the conversation to realize how far out of her depth she would have been. The presentation itself went better than I dared hope. The Wen group was impressed not just by my language skills, but by the depth of research I'd done into their company culture and investment priorities. I'd spent the previous day not just reviewing Claudia's materials, but completely restructuring the proposal to align with what I knew about Chinese business practices. Ms. Taylor, Lisa Chen said about halfway through the presentation, switching to English. This is quite different from what Mrs. Beaumont outlined in our preliminary discussions. Much more comprehensive. I glanced at Jonathan, who gave me an almost imperceptible nod. Mrs. Beaumont provided excellent groundwork, I said diplomatically. But as our lead expert on Asian markets, I felt it was important to ensure our proposal reflected the cultural nuances that make partnerships successful. It was a polite way of saying that Claudia's preliminary proposal had been surface level at best, focused more on impressing them with her supposed language skills than on understanding their actual business needs. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, with increasingly detailed discussions about market entry strategies, regulatory compliance, and revenue projections. The Wen group asked probing questions in both English and Mandarin, testing not just my language skills but my understanding of Chinese business culture and practices. Claudia sat through the entire presentation in increasingly obvious distress. Every fluent exchange between me and the Wen group delegation was a reminder of how catastrophically her own presentation would have failed. When we finally concluded, David Wen shook my hand warmly. Ms. Taylor, this has been one of the most impressive presentations we've seen from an American consulting firm, he said in English. Your cultural understanding and language skills suggest a level of commitment to Asian markets that we rarely encounter. We look forward to moving forward with the partnership, Lisa Chen added. Assuming, of course, that you'll be our primary point of contact for the Asian expansion. Absolutely, Jonathan said quickly. Ms. Taylor has been instrumental in building our Asian market presence. After the Wen group delegation left, the conference room fell silent. Jonathan and the other partners were clearly thrilled. This was the kind of deal that could define the company's next decade of growth. But Claudia looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Well done, Sam, Jonathan said, gathering his materials. I think we can safely say that presentation exceeded everyone's expectations. He left with the other partners, diplomatically giving Claudia and me some privacy. She sat at the conference table for a long moment, staring out at the harbor. That should have been me, she said finally. No, I replied. It shouldn't have. You weren't qualified, and you knew it. That's why you spent 8 months trying to fake qualifications instead of actually developing them. I could have learned. In 8 months, you barely learned to pronounce basic phrases correctly. Becoming truly fluent in Mandarin takes years of intensive study. You wanted the prestige of closing an international deal without putting in the actual work. She turned to look at me, and for the first time since this whole situation began, I saw something other than anger in her eyes. She looked defeated. Jonathan's partners are going to want you on the board now, she said quietly. After a success like this, they'll see you as indispensable. It was probably true. The Wen Group deal was exactly the kind of coup that got people promoted to senior leadership positions. That was never my goal, I said. I just wanted to do my job without being fired over imaginary slights. But you'll take the promotion if they offer it. I considered the question. A board position would mean financial security, professional recognition, and the kind of influence that could shape the company's direction for years to come. If they offer it, I'll have earned it, I said finally. Claudia nodded slowly, as if accepting something she'd been fighting against for months. I suppose you have, she said, and walked out of the conference room. 3 weeks later, Jonathan called me into his office to discuss what he termed organizational changes. The Wen Group partnership had been formalized, with an initial investment of $60 million and commitments for additional funding as our Asian expansion progressed. The board has been discussing your role in the company's future, he said, gesturing for me to sit down. Obviously, your performance with the Wen Group has been exemplary. I appreciate that. See you. We'd like to offer you a position as Senior Vice President of International Development, with a seat on the board of directors and equity participation in the company. It was everything I'd worked toward for years, the kind of offer that would transform my career and my life. But I found myself thinking about the path that had led here, about Claudia's desperate attempts to prove herself, about the damage that lies and insecurity could cause, about the price of success built on deception. I accept, I said, with one condition. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Which is? I want to establish a professional development program for spouses and family members of senior staff. If they're interested in developing real business skills, we should provide legitimate opportunities for education and involvement, not just ceremonial positions. It was a diplomatic way of saying that what had happened with Claudia could have been avoided if she'd had genuine opportunities to develop her abilities instead of having to fake them. Jonathan smiled. I think that's an excellent idea. Claudia actually suggested something similar last week. I was surprised, but pleased. Maybe she'd learned something from this experience after all. As I left Jonathan's office, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here. 8 months ago, I'd been a desperate graduate trying to make rent by tutoring a mysterious client. This morning, I'd been offered a seat on the board of one of Boston's most successful consulting firms. The irony wasn't lost on me. Claudia had tried to destroy my career to protect her secret. But in the end, her secret had become the foundation of my success. I spent the rest of the day in meetings, planning the next phase of our Asian expansion and thinking about the future. The Wen Group partnership was just the beginning. There were opportunities in Singapore, Tokyo, Mumbai, and a dozen other markets where our expertise could make a real difference. Late that afternoon, as I was preparing to leave the office, I found an envelope on my desk with my name written in elegant handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of expensive stationery with a brief message. Ms. Taylor, I was wrong about many things, but I was not wrong about your abilities. Congratulations on your promotion. You've earned it. C. Beaumont. It wasn't exactly an apology, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes, acknowledgement is enough. I folded the note and put it in my desk drawer, then gathered my things and headed for the elevator. The sun was setting over Boston Harbor, casting long shadows across the financial district, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could finally breathe. The elevator doors opened on the ground floor, and I was surprised to see Claudia standing in the lobby, apparently waiting for someone. She looked up when she saw me, and for a moment, we just stood there. 2 women who'd been through a very strange war together. Sam, she said, her voice carefully neutral. Claudia. She hesitated, then stepped closer. I wanted to thank you. I raised an eyebrow. For what? For not destroying me when you could have. She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. When Jonathan told me about your condition for accepting the board position, the professional development program, I realized you could have simply exposed everything and let me crash and burn. You didn't have to offer an alternative. It was true. I could have played the recordings for the entire board, made sure everyone knew exactly how Claudia had tried to manipulate her way into a position she wasn't qualified for. It would have been satisfying, and it would have been justified. Everyone deserves a chance to learn from their mistakes, I said. Even you. She almost smiled at that. Even me. We walked toward the exit together, and I found myself curious about something that had been nagging at me for weeks. Can I ask you something? I said as we reached the revolving doors. I suppose I owe you that much. Why Mandarin? Of all the skills you could have tried to develop, why did you choose something so difficult to fake? Claudia was quiet for a moment, watching the evening traffic on State Street. Do you know what it's like to be married to someone like Jonathan? To be surrounded by his world, his friends, his business partners, and to constantly feel like you're being measured against some impossible standard? I didn't answer, sensing she needed to work through this herself. I have a master's degree in art history from Wellesley, she continued. I speak fluent French and Italian. I can plan a charity event for 500 people and raise $500,000 in a single evening. But in Jonathan's world, none of that matters. What matters is deals and numbers and expansion into new markets. So you thought learning Mandarin would prove you belonged in that world. I thought it would prove I could contribute something valuable, something that wasn't just about looking good at dinner parties and charity galas. She sighed. I suppose that sounds pathetic to you. It sounds human, I said honestly. Misguided, maybe, but human. We stood there for another moment, two women who'd found themselves on opposite sides of a conflict neither of us had really wanted. For what it's worth, I said finally, you're probably right that you would have been overlooked for board positions regardless of your qualifications. Corporate America isn't exactly famous for its progressive attitudes toward women, especially women who are seen primarily as wives rather than professionals. That's surprisingly diplomatic of you. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true. And because pretending it isn't true doesn't help anyone. Claudia nodded slowly. The professional development program you proposed. Will you really follow through on that? Yes. But Claudia, if you decide to participate, you'll have to do the actual work. No shortcuts, no fake credentials, no trying to impress people with skills you don't have. Real education, real effort, real results. I understand. And no more trying to destroy people's careers over imagined slights. She had the grace to look embarrassed. I was panicking. When I saw you at the gala, something about you seemed familiar, but I couldn't place it. Then when I realized where I knew you from, I thought if I could just get rid of you quickly. You thought you could eliminate the problem before I connected the dots. It was stupid. It was worse than stupid. It was destructive and vindictive and could have ruined an innocent person's life. She nodded, accepting the criticism. I know, I'm sorry. It wasn't a perfect apology, but it was honest, and that was more than I'd expected from her. I should go, I said. I have dinner plans. With anyone interesting? I smiled. Actually, yes, I'm celebrating my promotion with my parents. They're driving down from Worcester. That sounds nice. It is. They're the ones who taught me that respect is earned through competence and character, not through title or marriage or social position. Claudia winced slightly, but she nodded. They sound like wise people. They are. We said goodbye, and I walked toward the tea station, leaving Claudia standing in front of the building that had become the stage for our unlikely drama. 6 months later, I was sitting in my new office, corner location, Harbor View, and a door plaque that read, Samantha Taylor, Senior Vice President, International Development, when Jenny knocked and entered with a stack of applications. The first round of applications for the Professional Development Program, she said, setting them on my desk. 12 applicants for the pilot program. I flipped through them, noting the range of backgrounds and interests. Spouses of senior staff who wanted to develop marketing skills. Adult children interested in learning about international business, even a few current employees who wanted to expand their expertise. Near the bottom of the stack was an application from Claudia Beaumont. Under Areas of Interest, she'd written, International Business Practices, with particular emphasis on developing genuine language skills and cultural competency. Under Goals, she'd written, to contribute meaningfully to my husband's business success through legitimate expertise rather than perceived social advantages. Under Relevant Experience, she'd written, limited, but highly motivated to learn. It was honest, self-aware, and completely different from the woman who'd stormed into my office 8 months earlier demanding my termination. I approved her application. The professional development program launched 2 months later with tremendous success. Claudia turned out to be one of the most dedicated participants, showing up early to every session and staying late to practice. She'd given up her fantasy of instant fluency in Mandarin and instead focused on developing a solid foundation in international business practices. She was never going to be the person leading negotiations with Chinese investors, but she was becoming someone who could contribute meaningfully to strategic discussions about global expansion. And perhaps more importantly, she was becoming someone who understood the difference between earning respect and demanding it. The Wen Group partnership, meanwhile, had exceeded everyone's expectations. Our Asian revenue had grown from 12 million to 38 million in less than a year, and we were fielding inquiries from potential partners across the Pacific Rim. I'd hired 3 new staff members to support the expansion, including a brilliant recent graduate from MIT who reminded me of myself at that age. Hungry, talented, and determined to prove herself through competence rather than connections. One evening in late fall, I was working late when Jonathan stopped by my office. It had become something of a tradition. He'd often check in at the end of long days to discuss upcoming deals or strategic priorities. "How's the Morrison negotiation progressing?" he asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Better than expected. They're interested in our Seoul expansion plans, and I think we can close something by year-end." "Excellent." He paused, looking thoughtful. "Sam, I want you to know how much I appreciate everything you've done this year. The Asian expansion, the professional development program, the way you handled everything with Claudia. Just doing my job. No, it's more than that. You had every right to be vindictive after what she tried to do to you. Instead, you found a way to turn the situation into something constructive for everyone involved." I leaned back in my chair, thinking about the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. "Jonathan, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Did you know about Claudia's inadequate preparation for the Wen Group presentation?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I suspected something was off," he said finally. Her sudden interest in leading the negotiation, her claims about language skills she'd never demonstrated before. But I wanted to believe she was capable of what she claimed. Maybe I needed to believe it. Why? Because I love my wife, and I wanted her to succeed, even if success meant taking risks that might have damaged the company. It was an honest admission, and I respected him for it. "For what it's worth," I said, "I think she's genuinely committed to developing real skills now. She's been one of our most engaged participants in the professional development program." "I know. And I think a lot of that is because of how you handled the situation. You gave her a path forward instead of just consequences for past mistakes. Everyone deserves a chance to grow. Not everyone would have seen it that way." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the lights come on across Boston Harbor. The city looked different from my new office, more expansive, full of possibilities I was only beginning to explore. "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Jonathan said eventually. "The board has been talking about expanding your role again. We're considering creating a new position, Chief International Officer, with responsibility for all overseas operations, not just Asia." It was a stunning offer. The kind of position that would put me among the most senior executives in the company, with influence over decisions that could shape our direction for decades. What would that mean for the current international team? They'd all report to you. Bigger budget, bigger staff, bigger opportunity to make an impact, and bigger responsibility if things go wrong. That's always been true. But Sam, this year has proven that you can handle complex challenges with both competence and integrity. Those are rare qualities. I thought about my parents, still running their small accounting firm in Worcester, who taught me that success without integrity was just elaborate failure. I thought about the scared graduate student who'd started tutoring a mysterious client to pay off loans, never imagining where that decision would lead. And I thought about Claudia, working diligently in conference rooms and online seminars, trying to build the skills she should have developed years ago. I accept, I said, with the same condition as before. We continue investing in programs that help people develop real capabilities, not just the appearance of them. Jonathan smiled. I wouldn't expect anything else from you. As he left, I turned back to my computer to finish the Morrison proposal. Outside my window, Boston was settling into evening, the harbor reflecting the lights of a city that had become home in ways I'd never expected. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw the announcement about your promotion in the Globe? Congratulations. You've earned every bit of success that comes your way. See. I smiled and put the phone away. Some stories don't end with dramatic confrontations or devastating revenge. Sometimes they end with people learning to be better than they were, finding ways to build something constructive from the wreckage of their mistakes. Sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to let someone else's limitations define your own possibilities. I worked until nearly 10 that night, planning the next phase of our international expansion and thinking about the future. There were opportunities in markets we'd never considered, partnerships that could transform not just our company, but entire industries. When I finally packed up to leave, I walked past Claudia's old haunts, the executive conference room where she'd once held court, the reception area where she'd commanded attention and deference. Now those spaces belonged to people who'd earned their place through competence and dedication. The security guard nodded as I passed through the lobby. Working late again, Ms. Taylor? Just getting started, Miguel. Just getting started. Outside, Boston glittered with promise and possibility. I'd started this journey as someone desperately trying to keep her head above water financially. Now I was someone with the power to shape international business relationships and create opportunities for others to grow and succeed. The woman who'd tried to destroy my career over an imagined slight had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible. Proof that competence and integrity could triumph over privilege and deception. And in the end, that was the only revenge I'd ever really needed.